to Health System CIO's interview with Karen Habercoss, VP and Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer with the University of Chicago Medicine. I'm Anthony Guerra, founder and editor-in-chief. Karen, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Anthony.
All right, Karen, if you want to start off, tell me a little bit about your organization and your role. I know we're going to talk a bit about your role because it's changed, and we'll have a lot of fun talking about that. But let's start off there.
Yeah, so the University of Chicago Medicine Health System is an academic medical center. We have a three-part mission. So we serve patients in a clinical care capacity. We educate students of all kinds, medical students, non-clinical students, social work students, all types of business students. So we have an education focus, and then of course we have a research mission as well, where we do human subjects and non-human subjects research.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about your role. I believe your background, or at least your most recent role before you added on the CISO role, was really in privacy. Tell me sort of a little bit about the evolution of your journey that's gotten you to where you are today.
Yeah, so it actually starts before I became the privacy officer here. So early on in my career at the University of Chicago, I was a clinical social worker here. So for about the first 13, 14 years of my career, I worked as a clinical social worker treating patients in the Department of Psychiatry,
Hmm.
and then made a career switch into the compliance arena, went to work for the Joint Commission, which is an accreditation body for health systems and healthcare providers, and then began to really focus in compliance around privacy specific topics. And then came back to the University of Chicago Medicine in about 2016 and became the privacy officer maybe about 4 years ago now.
Hmm.
And then became the CISO just in September of this year. So we can talk a little bit about that. I think that's one of the things that we're going to talk about is how that happened. It's interesting. People ask me, how did you switch from being a clinical social worker into compliance? I worked for a startup company for a short period of time in the interim between being a social worker and being the privacy officer. And when you work for a startup, you wear lots of different hats. One of the hats I wore included compliance of all sorts. And so that's really where I started the career in compliance. And then, of course, honed my skills when I went to the Joint Commission.
So that's all very interesting, and sort of the clinical background for being a clinical social worker, exposed to a lot of that kind of stuff. Then compliance, and privacy; those are all well connected. What's most interesting to me is the addition of the CISO role, which to me would be a role that usually has quite a bit of technical IT expertise, technical. A lot of people come out of infrastructure and things like that. Where did you sort of pick up that kind of knowledge?
Yeah, I would say that along the way, the last many years that I've been here in privacy, starting around 2016, 2017, I worked under a mentor of mine who had obviously a very strong security background and spent a lot of time educating me, bringing me up to speed on things. The privacy program has been fairly close to the security program at University of Chicago Medicine for quite some period of time. And so learned a lot just being adjacent
Mhm.
to the security team and how they functioned. And then began to do some work with the Health Sector Coordinating Council, putting together um, some best practices for how privacy and security teams can and should be working together to mitigate risk in the institution, and did a lot of reading and seeking other people out
Mhm.
and just asking, how are you doing things in your organization? Tell me, tell me what you're doing, and then trying to figure out what we were doing here differently or the same.
That's great. That's very obviously very impressive, to just pick that up. So as you mentioned, the departments over there of security and privacy were well connected. Um, and I guess I want to ask you to describe your thoughts around what that relationship should be. Maybe I think the assumption here is that it's not what it could be or should be in many health systems. And that could be, I guess, the evolution of how these things sort of evolved to come up, and that's why maybe they're somewhat siloed. But they brought them together in your organization. Um, Tell me about that.
Yeah.
How should they be working? What's the problem when they're not working closely together? We'll go from there.
Yeah, I think so. I've had the luxury here of seeing what it was like. So privacy here had been part of the compliance office for a very long period of time. And then it moved into the IT space and sat within the information security office. And then it moved again to its own single department, just privacy, so outside of compliance and security. And now there's more of a harmony where the two departments sit adjacent to each other, but under the same leader, myself. And so I've had the luxury of seeing what each of these look like. And I think the way that I'm biased, obviously, the way that it looks right now is probably the right way in my mind. And so, I think one of the things as part of the work that came out of the Health Sector Coordinating Council and the best practices for privacy and security is that we realized that there are really these five themes, if you will, for how privacy and security have challenges. And so, we took a high level step back to take this view of what is it the privacy folks wish the security folks knew about them, and then in return, what is it security wished privacy knew.
Mhm.
And so the five areas really, we talked about a lot of different things, but they fall into generally these five themes. So the first being this idea of cross functional alignment. So they both have different goals, but how do you coordinate your efforts? How do you understand what are the priorities that each have? What are the goals of each, department in the larger entity system that you have? You certainly have systemic goals and strategies that you're running toward, but the departments have their own as well.
Mhm.
And so there has to be this alignment, but it requires collaboration. And so problems can occur when there's this undefined sort of separation of duties, or role coverage isn't quite understood, and so the other department thinks the other is handling something when they're not. Or there hasn't been this mutual strategy, and so it's not really identified what you're working toward, and so there's inherent conflicts there. The other interesting thing is that you're both working really toward the same end goal, right? Like, you want to protect patients, you want to protect the data, you want to protect your institution, your employees, but we use different language to say the same thing. And so sometimes that language can also obscure the message and present challenges. So that's sort of the first area. The
Mhm.
second area is really around this concept of just operationally understanding the day to day responsibilities. So, what do the privacy analysts, for example, do all day long? What do the security engineers or IAM team or GRC team, what do they do all day long? And so, sometimes there are redundancies or inefficiencies that happen. And so that can significantly impact, or there's this extreme separation of duties. And so it really requires this deliberate effort to really understand what each are doing, so that, the decisions being made are not short sighted.
Mhm.
and that they really involve this whole systemic perspective. And also understanding, that in many cases, the industry recognized frameworks are there. And so the interesting thing is that privacy is more recently, because of NIST privacy framework, that's become something that privacy professionals understand slightly more than they probably ever did in the past. Whereas on the security side, frameworks have been around for quite some period of time. It's a very understood um, standard. And so that didn't really exist in the past in privacy. So when security folks talked a lot about frameworks, it wasn't really well understood as one example. The third area probably is just around general team dynamics. And so this is where I like to put my social work hat on. And this is really about the interactions, the trust, the support. Is there a feeling that you can lean on each other?
Mm.
And this really can, just like in any organization, this idea of trust and transparency, it can really hamper when two teams are trying to meet the same goal. And this could be things like competition for resources, that the leaders are not, efficiently doing what they need to do to collaborate. The expectations are different, and so it's very unstable or unpredictable. You can't rely on the others. So this sort of fragmented trust can happen, and that can have challenges. And then the two other ones have to do with just the organizational culture. So every entity has their own culture, right? Their own systems, their own values. So it's not just at the team level, but it's what does the larger organization say? So if the larger organization is prioritized only around cybersecurity, for example, the
Mhm.
privacy team is going to feel that maybe they can be a part of that, they can be helpful, but people don't recognize how that is.
Mm.
And so this idea, of planning and absence of sort of shared governance, redundancy of education initiatives. So you've got, people within the organization saying, I just got that training, when
Mhm.
it's a different training for privacy and security, when maybe there's one of the things I can talk about later is one way to solve this is to combine training efforts. And so some of these are real and some of these are perceived issues, but perception for many people is what it is, and so that's something that teams need to think about. And then lastly, it's just the idea that's on everyone's mind, which is the regulatory responsibilities that we all have. Privacy regulation is been something certainly at the federal level. I mean, in healthcare, and HIPAA is widely known for many years. Just got an update regarding reproductive, healthcare, but it's been around a while, privacy
Mhm.
rule regulation. But any other privacy regulations that health systems are tracking to, and there are lots of others at the state level now, because most privacy programs nowadays no longer just focus on patients. They are starting to think about employee privacy, or what I like to call consumer privacy. So these are people who are not yet your employees, not yet your patients, may not, ever come to you, but are just seeking general information.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, there are all kinds of privacy laws at the state level or international level. We haven't been terribly successful at the federal level, aside from HIPAA.
Mhm.
Um, but cyber has been very front and center. They're very well organized. And so they tend to, you see a lot of regulatory focus or talk
Mhm.
about what needs to happen in the cyber world and the regulatory responsibilities and how they might align with NIST framework, things like that.
Mhm.
So that's really where the challenges all start to happen. And then once you identify the challenges, you can start to think about current state. So where is it that you're at now? And then you can plan out, where do you at your organization want to be?
Mhm.
So that was a pretty long-winded answer
It's
to the
good.
challenges, but yeah.
That's very good. There are a lot of titles in the healthcare IT C-suite that have evolved over the past couple of years. CIO, CISO, Chief Privacy Officer, which is not really IT. Now there's chief digital officer, chief clinical informatics officer, chief nurse. There's a lot of titles, and a lot of times when I ask people about what's important, they'll say, "Well, you can have any kind of mix of titles. That's not really important. You have to have the right people that are make sure there are no gaps in actually what people are doing. Sort of the titles, not a big deal. Which titles you have, which titles you don't. When it comes to this kind of stuff you're talking about around privacy and cyber and compliance, what do you think matters and what doesn't? You talked about sort of trying to find a home for these functions and it taking a few steps until it sort of found a natural home. So, in your mind, what matters here and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think some of this goes back to organizational culture in my mind. And so I think it depends on where your entity sees the value. I
Mm,
mean, I think it would be hard. I would be hard pressed to say that titles don't matter because I think they probably do to some extent. I mean, in most organizations, titles give you the ability to move the needle with certain people if you need to. That's just a
mhm,
fact.
mhm,
Um, However, what I think is probably more important is any leader's ability to understand how to create value in your organization and the people that you need that are important to rally around what you're trying to do.
mhm,
So I don't know that it's the compliance officer or the privacy officer or the chief information security officer or digital whatever we're calling these things. Regardless, any leader in my mind needs the ability to make connections in the organization with the right levels of people to get the strategy moved forward. But it's also incumbent upon the CISO or the CPO or the compliance officer to understand what the general strategy of the overall organization is, right? So in some organizations, there's organic growth or inorganic growth or whatever is the mindset of the larger C suite and most of the time also at the board level. What are they trying to accomplish in your
mhm.
organization? And then the privacy and security officers need to align themselves against that value system. We all
Yeah,
have jobs to do. We have to secure our organizations at the most basic level. We have to keep data private. Those things are required. But
yeah,
how you do those, in my mind, it generally works around how you can influence the people in your organization to have understanding about what it is you do and what you bring to the table, the value you can add.
yeah. That's excellent. When it comes to the sort of messaging that's important, that's put out by the CEO and the board, and you were talking about that. What I was thinking was you could get different types of messaging from your, we'll call it leadership, which would help inform how you go about your job. For example, one type of messaging might be, we want to grow, 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 right? And we have a high level of risk tolerance. So go
Mhm.
grow, right? Exchange information, make partnerships, go grow. Another type of messaging, and I'm giving extremes, could be, I don't want any kind of cyber event because I don't want us in the news, and that's the number one mandate. Stay secure, keep us secure. Those two mandates are different and would inform your work differently. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
I think yes, that makes sense to me. I think that makes sense, and that is exactly what I'm trying to say. Is you need to understand what what is the mindset
Hmm.
of the topmost people leading your organization. Yes, I mean, I think it's privacy to some extent, and cyber certainly it's risk based.
Yeah.
And so it's really important. Nobody understands that better than the privacy officer and the CISO. I mean, you're in it with the team, you're in it, you are sort of the one straddling the fence, right? You're in it with your team, you're setting the strategy there, but you're also basing it on the strategy that the leadership team and the board wants you to pursue. And there are many, I tell this in my organization all the time, there are many ways we can do things.
Mhm.
But to your point, here are the risks involved.
Mhm.
Where do we sit? How much risk do we want to accept? There's no entity I'm aware of that has unlimited resourcing, not unlimited funds, not unlimited people, none of that. And
Mhm.
so, in order to be strategic about the asks you have to be able to put forth your strategy in a way that the leadership team feels like you are supporting where they want to either grow or not grow or what they are trying to do.
Right.
And then when you lay out the risks, you can start to have a real live discussion about, we are a very large system. And so this is where the risks lie. And
Mhm.
this growth or this expansion, might make sense for these reasons, but the downside of it is that it's harder for me to secure, for example, or it's going to take
Right.
a lot more people or resources, or we're going
Right.
to have to change the way we do something.
Mhm.
So it's really goes back to even what I was talking about between privacy and security. It's really about making sure that people have the information to make the decisions that need to be made.
Right, so it's a you're articulating this very well. So as a leader, when you're presenting to the leadership, as we spoke about, the people making those decisions, you want to make a presentation that reflects the mandate they've laid out and the direction so you can show, I understand the direction you want to move in. Here's how we move in that direction, but here's the risk that comes with that. And if we want to mitigate the risk, here are some of the things we can do. The money I'll need, then we can get the risk down to this level, which is more comfortable while still going the direction you want. And that's when you get feedback, which is, well, okay, we'll do that investment, or that's too much risk and we don't want to spend that money. So we're going to pull back on something, right? It's all these levers that need to be
Correct.
adjusted. But people in your position are the ones to present the case, but not ultimately make the decision about what risk wants to be engaged with, correct?
I think that's right to an extent, but again, I'm sort of hedging. I'm sounding very much like a with my privacy hat on, which is what we do in privacy all the time. We sort of hedge. It depends. I think it depends. I mean, because in my mind, it depends on your organization. So at University of Chicago, I feel very well supported by both my board and my executive leadership team here, which I'm a part of.
Mhm.
And I do realize that not all CISOs or CPOs, feel that way or are in that circumstance. And so maybe the discussions are different. But here, that's not to say that I don't go to meetings and people are like, no, we're not going to do that. And that's fine, but people here are very much willing to listen, to take what I have to say at face value, really consider, what is happening. And it doesn't mean that things will start or stop. It just means that people are very much engaged in both cyber here and privacy. And so for that, I am very appreciative because
Mhm.
I feel like I have a seat at the table in any table that I want to be a part. That is not always the case in other entities. But I think that's a value driver here.
Final question, and then I'm gonna let you go.
Okay.
Trust. Talk to me. You said they'll listen to you. That's a case of you earning the trust of leadership. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way for me to answer that is that I have been at University of Chicago Medicine for a long period of time. I started in the clinical space here. I started as a privacy officer. I've got longevity. I've got relationships with people that I have, put time and effort into, in some cases, more than 20 plus years.
Mhm.
In some cases, there are physician leaders here that when I was a clinical social worker early in my career, they were residents and fellows. I mean, we've grown up in our
Yeah.
careers together. And so, that is just a function of how I've earned trust here. And being able to deliver on the things that I say that I can, and being transparent and honest on the things that I think are problematic.
Right.
So I think that's how trust is earned over time.
Karen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and hope I can reach out in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
You as well.